This is Breakpoint This Week, a weekly briefing on faith, culture, worldview, and mission with John Stonestreet, president of the Colson Center for Christian Worldview.
Well, welcome to Breakpoint This Week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith. And I want to begin today's conversation talking about a friend of ours who made an appearance on Facebook to share some really good news. We've called our folks a couple times now to pray for Joni Eareckson Tada as she has dealt with her cancer battle for the second time. And she posted on Facebook, again, another round of good news, which is really welcome news. And it came to mind because here as I record this, I'm spending time at an event in California with some of our ministry friends where Joni Eareckson Tada is going to receive an award that I think is well-deserved, the Alan Sears Leadership Award, an award named after Alan Sears, the founder and leader of the Alliance Defending Freedom for a really long time. And so had the opportunity this week to spend some time with Joni and her husband Ken, and just wanted to first of all say, man, any award she gets, she probably is overqualified for.
That's right.
And deserves. But it's just great to honor her and to spend a little bit of time rejoicing in that good news.
Well, it is. And of course, at the Colson Center, John, in addition to the fact that you're actually out there right now, we've had a long association with both of those organizations, both Joni and Friends and Alliance Defending Freedom. Alan Sears received our Wilberforce Award just a couple of years ago, and Joni is an earlier recipient of that award. I have often called Joni a national treasure. I mean, and I don't think that's an exaggeration. I mean, she is just such a remarkable person. For one thing, she's just a brilliant intellect. That's the thing that I think has struck me most about Joni as I've gotten to know her over the years, is that not only is her personal story so compelling, and I know millions of people have read about it because of her best-selling book, Joni, and her involvement in the ministry, Joni and Friends, but she's just a really brilliant person. She speaks deeply and thinks deeply about a whole lot of issues, and I couldn't agree with you more that any award she gets, she deserves.
You know, the thing that impresses me, too, is not just the intellectual depth, which, of course, it's there, and not only in theology, but definitely in theology, but also worldview, cultural kind of analysis. And that brings up a story quite disturbing this week, because one of the things that Joni has done is really turned her life story, which is remarkable, into an entire life of advocacy for others. And also standing for, you know, what we say, ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims, and a culture of death, you know, breeds death. And we're seeing that in France. Now, euthanasia is one of the causes that Joni has been clear on. It's also one of the things that we have said is kind of marching across America right now in the form of doctor-assisted suicide. Just this, you know, we've long struggled with death at the beginning of life. Now we're talking about it at the end of life. But it's illegal in France, but essentially what we had this week was the death of Vincent Lambert from passive euthanasia. I mean, essentially withholding what's called miraculous or extreme measures of, you know, saving. It's called extraordinary support, extraordinary measures. But essentially it's food and water. Yep. And he passed away this week after a judge decided that he was in a persistent vegetative state, which many experts disagreed with.
Well, that's right. In fact, he was in a semi-conscious state. In other words, this wasn't a guy that was, and I even hesitate to use these words, that was a vegetable, so to speak, who was not responsive in any way. He was responsive in some ways. And not only that, his parents wanted to keep him alive. At least two of his siblings wanted to keep him alive. He had, you know, been in this state for 10 years. He was 42 years old this week when he passed away. So, I mean, I'm not trying to say, John, and I don't think you are either, that this was an easy situation for the family. I can't imagine how extraordinarily difficult it was been for the family and would have continued to be for the family. But if you're going to stand for life, you got to stand for life. And the country of France, I think, really took a turn this week. This case became a national news story. And of course, we're talking about it here in the United States, so it's an international news story. But I mean, it was a really big news story in France. And I think it has caused some national soul searching in that country.
Well, and yeah, and you basically a divide in the family where Lambert's wife was pushing for the removal of the feeding tube, and his Catholic parents, were not. And of course, there's this, well, I know what he would have wanted, I know what he would have wanted. And that's the problem with these sorts of conversations. When you start kind of figuring out, okay, is food and water extraordinary measures? who gets to say this person, that person? Who gets to say what the patient would have said, that person or this person? I mean, these are lines that become so fuzzy. And once death is on the table, once euthanasia is actually an option, there's always a way to get there in the name of convenience, in the name of, ease of suffering, whether it's some sort of moral high ground or not. And that's why I think you're right when you say that France has taken a turn. These aren't things that you necessarily recover from as a nation, these decisions that are made. Speaking of which, it's a very similar situation, of course, years ago to the situation with Terri Schiavo. And that's one that I think has put our nation on a particular path. And now we have, I don't know how many states now that have legalized doctor-assisted suicide. I was having this conversation a few weeks ago here in Colorado about Colorado because I think there's a connection that's not often made between high suicide rates in general and the legalization. I mean, if you say it's okay legally, but then turn around and tell, for example, teenagers, hey, suicide's not the answer. Really, do we not think that they're smart enough to figure out the inconsistency on that? And I bring that up because I think there have been, in the teen world, this influx of literature, some movies, stories. Many say glamorize suicide. We've talked before about 13 Reasons Why. But to me, there's got to be a connection between the legal, political advocacy and justification of death by choice and what we see in culture and pop culture and how that's going to move a generation, particularly a younger generation.
Well, I think that's exactly right, John. The stories that show up in our media, even, not in the news media, but as you said, in a series like 13 Reasons Why, really does have a huge impact in the way people think. You and I will sometimes talk about this saying that's attributed to C.S. Lewis. I'm not exactly sure he said it, but he said something along the lines of that it's not the ideas that are argued in a culture that are the most dangerous, but the ideas that are assumed. And one of the things that shows like 13 Reasons Why or a new HBO documentary that's debuting this week that portrays suicide in a positive light is that it causes us as a culture to take that turn. We stop arguing about it and we just assume that suicide is okay or is justified in some circumstances. That's when a culture, that's when a nation, that's when a society has taken a very, very dangerous turn.
Well, you're listening to Breakpoint this week. Come to breakpoint.org. Click on the link on the homepage there that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to stories and articles and the various things that we talk about on today's program. And you can also find out about the different things that are happening at the Colson Center, including our book offer this month for a donation to the Colson Center. You can get a copy of a terrific new book to help you equip the next generation in Christian worldview and faithfulness to God, written by Sean McDowell and J. Warner Wallace. It's called So That the Next Generation May Know. Again, come to breakpoint.org. I'm John Stonestreet here with Warren Smith. We'll be right back.
We invite you to visit Breakpoint.org. While you're at our website, be sure to browse our online Colson Center store of great books and other resources. And you can link up to our social media sites like Facebook and Twitter.
Welcome back. You're listening to Breakpoint This Week. I'm Warren Smith with John Stonestreet. And, John, a couple of years ago, you and I and our families were both fans, I'm not embarrassed to say, of the Netflix program Stranger Things. But now we're into the third season. The third season was released on the 4th of July, and I've got to say that I'm not as big a fan as I was the first season, and I wouldn't think that you could really call this a kid's show anymore.
No, it's not a kid's show, and it's kind of like what we, saw with shows in the past, like The Wonder Years or other shows where, you're kind of, with these kids, the Cosby Show, you're with these kids as they're growing up. These kids on Stranger Things seem to be growing up a little faster than the rest of us. But there's a reason that this show had such, I think, incredible appeal for folks in my generation. I mean, that's when we grew up, man. I remember this season is centered, for example, on the shopping mall coming, to town. And I remember when the shopping mall came to town in Winchester, Virginia, man. It was a big, big deal. And it was, one of those kind of marvels of modern engineering. Look at all these stores in one place, and you can get everything. And it was a big deal. So there's a bit of nostalgia to it. the writing is, and the character development is fascinating. These kid actors have captivated everybody. And I'd love to hear kind of what you think. I've got some thoughts here, having watched through season 3. What you think in terms of that they're growing up a little too fast. We can't call it a kid's show. What's sticking in your craw? I certainly have a couple complaints, even though I'm acknowledging that, again, incredible storyline, great storytelling. The characters are great. The actors are great. There's so much to like about this that it's at the same time just super unfortunate, the direction that it's taken in a couple areas.
Well, I think you're exactly right, John. And I agree with you that there's still reasons, at least for me as a grown-up, and I hope exercising some discernment to watch it. The shopping mall sort of angle, it really is fascinating. I didn't even know there were Orange Julius's anymore, but there may not be for all I know. But to see these shopping malls sort of reconstructed as they were in the 1980s with some of the old brands that either no longer exist or look real different today than they did then is, as you said, a whole lot of fun to see. And, when the second season of Stranger Things came out, John, I wrote about it for the Breakpoint website, and I basically said then what I think is continued now in season 3 is that, you get sucked into these kids' lives and these kids' stories, and it's not just kids. There's some other great actors in there as well. But then the storylines and the language and the activities that these kids are engaged in just become rougher and rougher and rougher. I would have said to many families during season 1 that this is one of those very few shows that the entire family could sit down and watch and enjoy for their own reasons, and the parents not be embarrassed, not have to, turn it off. I just don't think that's the case anymore. The language has gotten a lot rougher. The violence has gotten a little less cartoonish. The situations these kids are involved in, you talked about them growing up so fast. Now there's some romantic relationships beginning to develop between these kids. And I think it's also interesting that some of these so-called teenagers or high school kids, they're actually portrayed by actors that are in their early to mid-20s. So the 4 core kids look like kids, but a whole lot of the other characters don't anymore. And I think that's a little bit deceiving and frustrating and disappointing as well.
So there's another way that this series harkens back, to the 80s and 90s. And, the movies in the 80s and 90s were highly existentialist. And what I mean by that is it's a typical storyline. You can walk through, Back to the Future, E.T., Ferris Bueller's Day Off. You can walk through almost all of these films from then. And what do you have? You have this idea that authority is bad and the kids are going to save the day. Authority can't be trusted, and the kids, by playing by their own rules, are now going to be the ones who save it. And so it had this kind of strong existentialist twist that you can't go by tradition, you can't go by what's established, and you got to make your own rules. Well, that's something that in this season 11 actually says, I play by my own rules. I mean, it's almost like a quote from these movies from the 80s and 90s. So I did find that fascinating. As these kids have grown up, it's become even more and more a distrust of authority. And of course, in the past, it was a government agency that couldn't be trusted. And this year, spoiler alert, it's another nation that can't be trusted.
Right.
But the authorities in the town can't be trusted either. So there's that dynamic, which I find to be kind of another hearkening back to the 80s and 90s. But look, and this is going to be a spoiler alert. So if you're going through the series and you haven't hit episode 6 yet, then you might want to, sit this one out. By the way, have you caught episode 6 yet, Warren?
I have not gotten to episode 6 yet. I'm about probably up to 4 or 5, as a matter of fact.
So you might want to close your ears.
No,
if
that's
you don't
okay.
Want a spoiler
that's all right.
alert. But it's been talked about. There's an obligatory, and you kind of wondered, kind of going through the first season and second season, is the mandate, the call that every single aspect of culture has to acknowledge and bow to the LGBTQ, censors. Is that going to be acknowledged in the show? Because up until this point, it really hadn't. And sure enough, there in season 3, episode 6, you have a new character to this season who announces sexual orientation in a particular scene. And there's 2 things about it that deeply bothered me. First of all, the very existence of it, right? Look, why? What's the point on this? How does this change anything? How does this, make the series so-called acceptable? And it's just amazing. I mean, we wrote just recently on the U.S. women's soccer team and how politically active they were, particularly around these issues. And Jaylene Hinkle, who's probably one of the best left backs in the game, being left on the team. And many of us speculate, Eric Erickson was one of them, I was another, that, look, it's just too suspicious.
Yep.
That because of what the stand that she has taken for her faith against, wearing a rainbow-colored jersey or whatever, it's just too suspicious that she left off the team. It was an article that got some attention. Washington Times and wrote on it. It was picked up by the Daily Mail this week and Fox News and some others, so kind of went around. And one of the things I said with the reporter in the interview for this article was, and what other force, what other group has that level of power in our culture that essentially can take an entire industry like the airline industry for an entire month, and actually most industries, and make them change their Twitter profile and bow to this. And that's the thing, is I see in Stranger Things, like it was surviving quite nicely, language aside, without having to bow to this agenda, and there it is.
Yeah, it didn't further the storyline. It didn't really help with the development of a story. And by the way, it just sort of rang false, because you just wouldn't have expected, probably, during the 80s, a character situated in this way to have even come out in the way.
Listen.
Yeah.
Now, that was the other thing that bothered me. It was anachronistic completely. It was a conversation in the politically correct 21st century that was superimposed back on the 1980s, when it just wouldn't have happened that way.
That's right.
First of all, we didn't use that sort of language of sexual orientation or identity language for this sort of thing. It was sexual attraction. When being gay or lesbian was being talked about in that cultural setting, it was sexual attraction. There wasn't any sort of kind of love or falling in love or fascination. That just wasn't part of the conversation. Sexual orientation as a category of thought is a very recent development in human history. It's not something that has been with us. It's the act itself. But yet that conversation went down using terms like identity, and the person receiving the news, no shock, just like, oh, okay, well, I was wrong about that, as if it were a completely normal thing to say. So it not only, I think, bowed its knee to the modern Baal, but how the conversation went down was just super disturbing, because it just wasn't realistic for as many other things as they're nailing about the 80s, and they're getting exactly right. They were so far off on how they described this scene. It's kind of hard to overstate it. Well, look, you're listening to Breakpoint This Week with Warren Smith and John Stonestreet, talking about the stories of the week from a Christian worldview. Come to breakpoint.org, click on the link for the homepage that says resources mentioned on the radio and podcast, and we'll link you to the various articles and resources on the topics that we talk about on today's program. And stay with us. We'll be right back.
You can learn more about Breakpoint and the Colson Center for Christian Worldview when you visit breakpoint.org. That's breakpoint.org.
Well, we're back on Breakpoint this week. John Stonestreet here along with Warren Smith, talking about what's happening in the culture week by week from a Christian worldview. And Warren, we just spent a good bit of time talking about Stranger Things, which says a little bit about kind of what a cultural phenomenon that it actually is,
Yep.
and talking about how this, another program, another industry bowing to what people say has to be now a part of everything, which is this statement on LGBTQ rights. We say all that because we talk about the force that this movement has had across our culture. And it really is, isn't it? I mean, it's really hard to imagine any other movement having that amount of power to change everyone's Twitter profile for an entire month. And yet, what we've done at the Colson Center around Breakpoint is talk about that there might be some cracks in the acronym. There might be some parts of the sexual revolution that have produced such inconsistencies that it's going to be hard for that to continue. One of the things that we've talked about, of course, is the growing rift between the L and the T being the transgender movement, the L being individuals who not only identify as lesbian, but also usually come from a pretty strong feminist background. And so now you have, a movement that's spent the last 30 years telling us that women are different than men and men can't understand women. And now you have a new member of the acronym party, the T, that's saying not only can men understand women, men can be women and appropriate all the rights and privileges thereunto. And so that seems to me to be a growing rift and a growing clash. And you brought my attention this week to another story that's just kind of interesting, the sides that we expect people to take on issues based on their alignment around sexuality and gender and so on, sometimes you can still be surprised, and this was a surprising story.
Yeah, it is a surprising story. It came from World Magazine about a group called Culture Reframed, led by a self-described radical feminist named Gail Dines, and one of the things that she's saying is that pornography has to be stopped, that if you are a true feminist, she says, and think about this for a second, I mean, a true feminist is, someone who sort of bought in hook, line, and sinker to the sexual revolution. But she's saying that if you're a true feminist, you've got to call for an end to pornography, that you can't merely remain silent on this question because there are too many victims, including many women who, of course, are victims. And she is trying to marshal support, not from religious people. Of course, conservative Christians have been opposed to pornography. I don't want to say forever and ever, but certainly for however long pornography has been in existence, Christians have understood that it is a violation of God's order, God's law, and God's highest and best for us as it relates to sexuality. But now these feminist groups are beginning to say, listen, we've got to stand against porn because it hurts women, it hurts children, it has become a public health crisis. She points out that 15 states have already declared pornography a public health crisis, and this is an exact quote: "If you're a feminist, you have to be anti-porn. Otherwise, you become PR machines for the porn industry." That's a pretty powerful quote.
It is, and it's also, to talk about these new strange alliances and these new strange movements. I mean, I would be remiss. You mentioned just a second ago that, conservative Christians have always been against porn. I mean, let's be clear that it's always been publicly against porn. There's way too high of an addiction rate among conservative Christians, just like everybody else. But we had just a crazy thing happen last year in terms of who's taking sides for what, where conservative Christians may be clear on this, but we had a liberal Christian, someone that I would say actually has now left the category of Christian, Nadia Bolz-Weber, a self-described Lutheran pastrix in Denver, Colorado, who advocated in her book for what she called ethically sourced pornography. In other words, if no people are exploited, then it's okay to increase the feelings in a relationship. So, I mean, how crazy is this that we have a self-described secular radical feminist saying, no, there's no way to do porn ethically. There's no way to do porn right. I mean, this is someone who doesn't have any sort of biblical categories whatsoever. And now you have someone who would claim the mantle of Christian saying the exact opposite. It just tells me that if we're going to quickly say, here's where the lines are drawn, we need to be a little bit more careful than that. And I think it's a tragedy that we're seeing that sort of dramatic reversal of roles. That's a crazy thing that's what's happened in the last year. We have a Christian pastor advocating porn and a secular feminist denouncing porn in the same year. You ever wonder if we're in the twilight zone here?
Well, I do wonder that. But I think really, John, you in a way put your finger on at least the Nadia Bolz-Weber piece of this, which is that she has departed the true way of Christianity. She, the things that she believes are no longer Christian. So why would we call her a Christian, even though she has identified as such? So I guess, where I come down on this particular story with Gail Dines and Culture Reframed is that while obviously we don't share the same theology, I do think that especially in a political environment that is so polarized and so divisive, I think we should look for opportunities where we can work with people like this on issues that we care about. And I think that was one of the reasons why World Magazine, which of course, John, you appear on World's podcast every week, and we have a very close relationship with World. I think that's why World wanted to highlight this story, and why, of course, we're highlighting it here is because it does kind of make plain that this is an issue that even the radical feminist can't ignore, that the victims are so many in number and so horribly misused by the porn industry that reality is kind of, if you will, winning the day. And we should look for more opportunities, I think, for this kind of co-belligerency, working with those that might not agree with us on everything, but could agree with us on some things, and maybe we can make a real inroad here.
Yeah, I think that's a really wise counsel right there. I think we're going to find ourselves with strange co-belligerence as the culture continues to move and shake, and it becomes more inconsistent because, here's the thing. Culture is what we make of the world, but reality is still what reality is. And, we can deny gravity, but gravity always wins. And we can deny other built-in parts of reality, how God designed us as human beings. But reality, again, is going to win the day. And we're going to find ourselves agreeing across some strange lines, I think, in the days to come. Yep. Well, you've been listening to Breakpoint This Week. It's our conversation about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview, hopefully a source of clarity and confidence for you as a believer so that you can live out a Christian worldview wherever God has placed you. And we'll be back again next week to have the same conversation. And you never have to miss an episode. If you have not subscribed to the Breakpoint podcast, not only can you catch this program each and every week, you can catch other content that we put up there, including our daily Breakpoint commentaries, 3.5-minute worldview nuggets on something happening in culture with a bit of clarity that only a Christian worldview can provide. Again, just subscribe to the Breakpoint podcast wherever you listen to your podcast, or you can also come to breakpoint.org. For Warren Smith, I'm John Stonestreet. Join us again next week as we talk about what's happening in the culture from a Christian worldview on Breakpoint This Week. We'll see you then.